We do have 7 members present, and that constitutes a quorum to conduct today's committee meeting. To introduce the members of the committee, to my far left, we have Representative Leila Staffler. To her right is Representative Ed Probst. To his right, Representative Christina Sablan. To my left is Vice Chair Representative Karina Magofnia. I'm the chair for Ways and Means, Donald Mangonia. And then to my far right, we have Representative Richard Lizama. To his left is Representative Vicente Camacho. Assisting the committee are the LB staff. We have our IT, Dell. We have our legal counsel, Joe. Our fiscal analyst, Thomas Ramago. Our legislative assistant, Ms. Claire Sablan, and Sergeant at Arms, Ben. Good morning, members. At this time, we'll just go down to the agenda. The floor is now open for public comments. It looks like there's none. And so we now move on to the adoption of agenda. Members, please review, and if you're ready, can I get a motion? A motion was made and seconded. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. Motion carries. The agenda is hereby adopted. We now move down to new business, and we have the Secretary of Finance and his team here to present to the committee several items that were requested by Vice Chair Karina Magofnia. So at this time, if we can dissolve into a committee as a whole to allow the Secretary and his team to join the members in the chamber. Good morning, Secretary Atalig. Welcome to the House Chamber. As you all may know, that this request was made through Vice Chair Representative Karina Magofna during her time as acting chair while I was away. While these are information that the members of the committee have requested through the chair, I would like to give the opportunity for the vice chair to take the lead on this and to preside over this meeting. And so I hand it over to the vice chair. But before she starts, if there's anything that the secretary would like to start off with, any opening statements or any remarks that you would like to give, we appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Mangonia. Good morning, Vice Chair Magofnia, and members of this awesome committee. Before I start on my opening remarks, I'd like to just introduce my fiscal analyst team behind me. I have Vinny Hokuk, who is our financial services manager. I have Travis Calvo's a fiscal analyst in the Secretary's office, as well as Arturo Palacios, who's also part of my financial team. Good morning, Chairman, and good morning, members of this committee. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all. The past 2 years has been unprecedented on many fronts. Never had we witnessed a collapse in the economy as we saw in 2020, when international flights ceased arriving into the CNMI. Never had we witnessed the impact of employment and business retention as a result of the global pandemic. And never have we been given a large amount of federal resources to respond to this challenge. Today, while we remain in the stage of response and recovery, due to the efforts of this administration and the COVID-19 task force, we are in a position of great strength and promise to be able to rebuild and grow beyond our circumstances prior to the pandemic. It was through the efforts of the Torres administration that the CNMI remained one of the safest places in the nation during the heights of this pandemic. It was through this administration that the delivery of vaccination was made efficient and widespread, leading to a total vaccination rate of more than the 100% across eligible individuals in our community today. It was through the early work of this administration that laid the foundation for the recovery of not just our tourism industry, but the wider possibilities of entrepreneurs and businesses throughout our islands. It was through this administration that our first responders and our tax-paying residents and households received compensation that will allow them to mitigate the impacts of this pandemic and support the wider economy seeking normalcy. And it was this administration that continued to keep the promises of full pension benefits to our retirees, even during this worst financial conditions in the Commonwealth. This was accomplished through leadership and the ability to utilize the available resources to respond and keep our communities safe. And looking forward, it's critical to realize that our successes against this pandemic cannot be separated from the progress in the economic recovery and our ability to rebuild the basis for this government's revenue generation, founded on the expenses we had to make to keep this community safe. I was requested by Vice Chair to provide this committee with reports on a lengthy list of items that paints the picture of the cost of this tremendous success for our community. I've made this information available to you and look forward to clarifying any questions you may have on the expenses and the funds and the activities of the Department of Finance. But the last 2 years have not been wholly encompassed by a response of the pandemic. The Department of Finance had made significant leaps in bringing the CNMI government into the 21st century. During this pandemic, we have launched a modern financial management system that takes place of decades-old, outdated and obsolete platform. This new system will build in greater accountability and efficiency in the management of the CNMI finances and will be the foundation of a new and modern method for residents to interact with the government in a transparent and accountable manner. We're the first administration to allow for the payment of business gross revenue tax, the largest of the CNMI revenue sources, to do so online, creating new and time-saving methods for our businesses to pay their taxes and support government services. We are in the process of simplifying the business development process with the creation of the EnerGov platform that will streamline government permitting and pave the way for new business development, economic growth, and greater revenue generation possibilities. The actions of this administration and these efforts will make life simpler for residents throughout these islands, and it's built on the realization that government cannot legislate business growth, cannot legislate job creation, cannot mandate recovery. We have endeavored to recognize that the government must make the process of doing these things by hardworking men and women in our private sector a lot easier. We are on our way to doing these things for the first time in generations. In addition to the many questions you guys have for me today, as to the expenses we have made to keep this community safe in this pandemic, I hope you can allot time to also understand and hear about the road ahead and the projects we have going forward to keep our islands prospering. I thank you and I look forward to the conversation we'll have today. And at this time, Chairman or Vice Chairman, I yield back to the committee.
Hello. Okay. Sorry. So thank you, Secretary Atalik, for your opening statement. And again, thank you for making the time to come up to the chamber and provide us with some reports. And we look forward to your updates and briefings with regards to all the expenditures, revenues, and other financial activities. With that said, we can go down the agenda and start off with our letter A, fiscal year 2021 annual fiscal report. So please go ahead and proceed and provide us with an update.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and thank you to our members of this committee. On January 21st, I submitted a fiscal year 2021 annual report, which you should have in front of you. Basically, in summary, without reading the whole report, to summarize our budget and collections We've collected about $146 million. We had a budget with Public Law 22-8 of $144 million. So we realized an additional revenue generated with different factors involved. We had a lot of wage and salary and income tax that drove our numbers above the actual budget. As we all know, we had a lot of PUA, and those that opted to have their taxes taken out of their PUA, we received. Keep in mind that the current legislation does not allow us to tax for PUA wage and income. So all these taxes received will be remitted upon tax refund or tax returns, and most likely 100% refunded. We also generated BGR levels that kind of fell a little short, as well as our excise tax numbers were short. This is not surprising, knowing that we're in the middle of a pandemic. Businesses were uncertain, and families spending expenditures were not as grand in terms of um, um, disposable income. Our government's expenditures, however, is a different story in terms of the different than our revenue projections or our revenue collections. We did report a deficit of $42.6 million. This is derived mainly from over close to $40 million in COVID-19 expenditures, which are also expected to be reimbursed through the FEMA uh, Public Assistance Office, and that is still being worked on. We also had expenditures that were separated from the disaster accounts. We had our law enforcement groups have their own separate accounts, charging their overtime and their expenditures for payroll directly to their accounts, and then submitting a request for reimbursement directly with FEMA, which attributed to a high number of the deficit in 2021. Of course, these numbers are not audited, so we are working on finalizing and working on an audit for the 2021 budget in terms of the FY 2020. We're working on wrapping up the 2020 audits as we speak, and there, in terms of getting the final number of our deficit, will be based on our actual audited financial statements when the time comes. But that is the report going forward that we are submitting to the auditors. We got to keep in mind also that in the FY 2021, we basically had an internal local economy. We did not have any um, revenues generated by other industry. As we all know, travel, tourism industry halted in March of 2020 and hasn't really gained any traction until we signed a travel bubble. The travel bubble was very promising in that we had numbers that were surprising. We had upwards an anticipation of 10,000 visitors for the month of December. However, with the introduction or the pandemic in terms of Omicron has uh, affected worldwide, it did pause the number and reduced a lot of cancellation. We are looking forward to that being resumed. We learned from tourism industry and those that are in South Korea that the numbers will continue to grow. We're expecting March, April, and May to have increased numbers to resume our tourism industry. At the same time, Mariners Visitors Bureau, along with the administration, are working on a travel bubble with Japan, and so we're hoping that we can have some charter flights in time for the their holiday period. I forgot what it's called. What was that? Golden Week. And so we're hoping and expecting several charter flights. Of course, we're working with USIS as well as the State Department to help us in making sure we want to secure this travel range or travel bubble with our federal partners to make that happen. We're being optimistic, but I'm being cautious. So I'm not expecting a large number, but the whole goal is to get our tourism market started so that afterwards and going forward, as we all learn how to live with COVID, that travelers will start coming to our islands. And so that's the outlook in terms of financial outlook, in terms of revenue generating going forward, as well as we all know that the ARPA funding allowed us to make um, significant progress in resuming these um, tourism market to get us a step ahead of our market competitors. Also, it's been able to help us keep all government employees employed, as well as lifting of our austerity, and that happened all within the FY 2021 budget year. And so there's significant amounts of investments through the ARPA that allowed our government to be full and to be whole, and that we have our employees contribute to our local economy. And that I can answer any questions you may have in terms of item 1, FY 2021 annual fiscal report.
Thank you, Secretary Atalik. So in your earlier statement, you had stated that um, a portion of the increase in collections was attributed to the PUA, which will be reimbursed back or refunded back to the taxpayers. And I'm just curious to know approximately how much are we looking at in terms of refund associated with that?
Um, Based on estimates that we've gathered for last calendar year, I'm looking in the upwards of 10 to 12 million dollars to be refunded from PUA.
May I now open the floor to members who have any questions pertaining to the first topic? Recognize Rep. Lazama.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and welcome again, Mr. Atalik, Secretary of Finance. Travel bubbles, which you mentioned, did we gain or we lost after all that $500 credit card that we given to each passenger? Did we gain or we are lost? I just need that answer.
If I understand your question, is have we
Revenue.
in revenue, in terms of revenue, we anticipated zero revenue coming in from the tourist bubble. In terms of prior to the tourist bubble, we anticipated nothing. So did we gain? We did gain in terms of um, traction into the tourism market. In terms of our investment towards it, and we were just looking at actual expenditures to actual revenue collection in tax revenue. It is an investment that we did, so we haven't realized any, as you would say in the business world, profit yet.
So my next question, sir, we anticipate more tourism coming in, but our numbers, when you look at the statistics nationwide, we're number 2. Would that affect us to the presumption that we're?
I assume you're saying number 2 in terms of the current levels of COVID
Yes, sir.
positive levels
Would that
numbers.
Would that encourage the tourists to come in, or would they be scared, afraid of coming? Because
I mean, I can speak on my own opinion. I'm not. I think it'd be the Mariners Visitors Authority that could probably
But
answer that in terms of.
you were saying
market.
that we're expecting that.
Yes, we are expecting. My understanding with having communication with the Mariners Visitors Authority and in the hotel industry, that we are anticipating an increase in tourists from the South Korean market. And this is attributed to also all 6 LCCs or low cost carriers, all submitting letters and intent to service our island, direct flights from all parts of Korea to come into our islands. That's the first time in history that's ever happened. We've always had 2 or 3 low cost carrier and 1 main ship, flagship, and that's Asiana Air. So now we have 7 airlines wanting and aggressively marketing our islands so that when the tail end of Omicron and the people start feeling confident in traveling, that the numbers, we have those routes readily available and approved. And so we anticipate in the next fiscal year having the numbers that Guam did in terms of from the South Korean market. We're looking and anticipating over 600,000 tourists coming from South Korea alone, not including our working with the Japan market. And obviously we know China market is out of the picture at the moment. Who knows down the road if that will happen, but we are focusing on the markets that are wanting to come to our islands. Yes.
Thank you for that information. I hear back.
Thank you, Rep. Zaman. Thank you, Secretary Atalik. I have a follow-up questions with regards to the travel bubble. So I understand that you are saying this is an investment, right? And I agree. But for our purposes, I would like to know, as of January 31st, 2022, how much have we spent in total for the travel bubble or any associated expenses with the travel bubble, and how much revenues has been generated from the travel bubble?
Great question. Thank you, Vice Chair, for that. I have some answers for that question. I don't have the full answer, and I'll make sure that we get you the full answer. But for the purposes of your question right now, we've invested or budgeted $15 million out of ARPA for the travel bubble program just for South Korea market. And of that, I believe we've spent upwards of over $8 million in terms of actual expenditures. You also requested down the report number, line item 7 is also as part of that trip program, the Travel Bucks program. And in the Travel Bucks program, we've spent I believe it's three some million dollars to date, $3.1 million to date on that program. Keep in mind the Travel Bucks program is funding that can only be spent on island, on only Saipan, Rota, and Tinian. It was issued in a form of a prepaid debit card that they can only use at the hotels and establishments here on island. And for those that wanted to use it, we've had, I do not have the numbers, but we've had people from the Korean market travel to Tinian and Rota using Travel Bucks to get them to and be utilized on those islands.
Thank you. I have another follow-up to that. So out of the 15 million, you've already spent $8 million. And out of the $8 million, 3.1 was spent on the travel box. Can you give us a breakdown of what the other expenditures were?
Yes, we will definitely. But part of the travel bubble and the trip program by MVA, we had expenditures for airline incentives. And so if airlines had a certain occupancy load, if they've, I think the number was at 45% occupancy. If they were below 45% occupancy, then they were, depending on the airline and the contracts they have with each individual airline from South Korea, it was upwards of 45,000 per flight. If on top of above, if they were above the 45% or the load factor, 45 or 50% load factor, then there was no subsidy, there was no incentive. And We found ourselves spending the majority of that in early October of 2021, as well as early part of November. But after that, throughout that, the planes were coming in pretty full, surprisingly and excitingly. And so we didn't have any expenditures to the airlines. Part of the trip program was a somewhat modified quarantine hotel site, which was contracted out to PIC and Kensington. So we also assisted in the operations of that quarantine site for these tourists and provided services to ensure that these visitors are secured at those facilities until their 5 days are up. And after the 5 days, they were free to leave the quarantine site, and most of them were booked like at World Resort and other accommodation, which I have no numbers on, but my concern was only on that contracted period of the 5 days while they're in quarantine. And it was modified where if their first day on arrival, they had a negative PCR test on arrival, then they would be allowed to roam the resort as if they were booked there as part of their vacation or their trip to the Marianas. We will get the breakdown for the committee, and I'll make sure my team
That'll be
prepares
great.
that.
Thank you. I was just curious, for the travel box, how much, for the airfare, how much have we subsidized to date?
For the airfare, that's the numbers. I will make sure that we get that to you in this committee. We have those numbers. It's not something that we gotta calculate. So we can get that to you by the end of the week at the latest.
Okay. And then on the travel box, do we know an amount of how much we've issued out versus how much was actually spent in the CNMI?
Yes, we have those numbers too.
Okay.
That we'll get that.
Great.
I know the total amount, $3.1 million, has been programmed and entered in to distribute. And
So
so
3.1 has been programmed to distribute, but we haven't distributed all 3.1 yet.
no, these are 3.1 million that were distributed.
already
We don't know if all 3.1 was used, because it's a use it or lose it. If they don't use it all, they can't use this in Korea. And so the remaining funds in their travel bucks card will be, we will be able to remove that amount and add it back to the program.
Is there an expiration date as to how long those funds are available until the CNMI can take those funds back?
Yes, they do put an expiration date of, I believe, 1 month.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah. Sure. Sorry, just before we move on, I would like to recognize other members of the committee that have joined in. We have Representative Selena Babauta to my far left and Representative Joel Comasho to my far right.
Mhm.
Joining us through video conference is Representative Danita Yangtamay. And I now recognize Representative Christina Sablan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Vice Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Secretary Atalig. Welcome. I had a couple of follow-up questions on the travel bubble and the trip program. And I guess my first one is if you could also provide the committee with a report on how much the government spent in administration and overhead costs for the committee with a report on how much the government spent in administration and overhead costs for the prepaid debit cards.
Oh, certainly. Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Do you have an estimate right now?
Uh,
Debit cards.
oh, certainly. Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Do you have an estimate right now?
I do not.
Was there a contract with?
We
the-
have a
the vendor?
contract with a vendor, the same vendor that did our stimulus cards. And I want to say there's a 1% fee, but I'll get that exact amount for you.
Okay, so there were two separate contracts for the local stimulus and for the travel bucks?
It was one contract for the Commonwealth,
Okay.
and that we allowed the MVA to utilize the same contract for the travel bucks program.
Okay. And then your report of approximately 3.1 million that was issued in travel bucks for tourists. So divided by 500, I'm assuming every tourist got just one card. So that would have amounted to 6,200 tourists that received. Does it break down
That's-
to that? Okay.
Yeah, that probably is correct.
Okay, thank you. I next had a couple of questions from your annual report. So the report indicates 37.9 million, indicates that 37.9 million of the total deficit for fiscal year 2021 was derived from the COVID-19 response, but that the government is only anticipating 18 million for reimbursement. Could you explain what the difference is? What about the remaining 19.9 million? Why would that not be reimbursable?
Good question. Actually, all of it is up for reimbursement. The 18.8 is already in the queue to be reimbursed.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're expecting those to be coming to the Commonwealth. The remaining are still in queue. We expect all expenditures to the COVID response to be deemed reimbursable. If it's in this account, then we expect it to be reimbursed, and thorough review through the GAR prior to getting it entered into this. If it is something that we know it won't be reimbursed, then those are directly charged to those departments or those agencies that are
Mhm.
providing the services.
Okay. So you are anticipating that there will be more that will be reimbursed.
Yes.
But I guess my next question then, so a subset of the deficit was related to law enforcement, and you reported $13.5 million, a total law enforcement deficit, and that this deficit was primarily related to the COVID-19 response, but charged to the general fund. Why would that not be reimbursable if it was related to COVID-19?
Thank you. Thanks, Rep. Saban. There are expenditures that at the time we don't consider reimbursable for FEMA. For those that are actually the frontliners and the backfill and the overtime for backfilling staff that are at the quarantine sites or performing frontline duties, those expenditures are not deemed reimbursable at the moment. We're still trying to get guidance to getting everyone or all expenditures related. But in the case of reporting and requirements, those that are backfilled, for example, with customs, we had a lot of officers at the quarantine sites and also at the airport in performance, but all the other duties that other officers had to provide their services in the hours overtime are not, in my opinion, not reimbursable until I get clarification. So those will not be reported as already in the queue for reimbursements.
Okay, so they could have been performing duties that were related to the COVID-19 response, but not directly related enough to be reimbursable?
I know what I'm saying is, we have, like in the case, the one I know for sure with customs, we have customs.
Enough to be reimbursable?
I know what I'm saying is, we have, like in the case, the one I know for sure with customs, we have customs officers that are detailed for COVID response. Then we have other officers that are backfilling or providing more hours or overtime on their own at the other ports or at the post office or at the office for collections and so forth. Those are not directly related to the actual COVID prevention and mitigation task as deemed as frontline.
Okay, so how much then of the $13.5 million law enforcement deficit do you expect will be reimbursed by FEMA?
I'm expecting that we'll request for all of it. I'm not sure of the total amount that will be reimbursed.
Okay. And then speaking of overtime, could you also provide us with an update of um, the government's collection efforts with respect to the typhoon overtime that the Attorney General has issued collection notices for? And I'm sure you saw in the papers a lawsuit has been filed against the DPS commissioner to recover that unlawfully paid overtime. But what is the status of collection efforts for everybody else who received these notices?
At this moment, I have not seen a penny, so I'm not aware of any actual collections unless collections has been made by the Attorney General and hasn't been remitted to Treasury. So I'm not aware of any actual collections at the moment.
Okay. Thank you. And then my final question for this round on the annual report, you mentioned, well, a couple of things that there have been strong collection efforts, and if you could describe what actions finance has taken over the past year to bolster collections, and then if you could provide us also with an update on how agencies and departments are actually complying with the new regulations, the new procurement regulations, in light of the COVID-19 emergency protocols that seem to supersede a lot of the procurement happening now. Could you give us an update on that?
I'll certainly give you an update on the procurement aspects. To your earlier question in terms of what has the department done to boost our collection efforts. We've done a lot of, we've added several FTEs to our audit and compliance team, or our, geez, I'm going through a mind blank, but we're doing more audits. We have more people looking at BGR submissions by certain companies. We've also increased our FTE numbers in enforcement, and so they're going out more often and identifying possible vendors that could be so-called trying to cheat the system. So those are being flagged to be audited, and our audit team has been successful in collections and reassessing BGRs from different vendors on island. So those helped. We're not done yet in terms of putting together we're trying to get the tools in place to do better enforcement and better oversight. So we just will be awarding a vendor to work on the revenue management information system. So we're updating our technology with the Rev and Tax Department division, and as well as customs, so that the tools that we have and will have in place will have audit programming to identify and flag businesses should there be, based on criteria that we place on what to look for. And so we're always working on trying to improve our enforcement and working to try to make sure and ensure that we have accurate accounting of people's taxes. And then the other information, we'll definitely get that to you.
On the procurement regulations?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield, Madam Vice Chair.
A quick one. Thank you, Secretary. Just a quick one. How much in total of ARPA was allocated for 2021?
For FY 2021, in terms of provisions of government, and I think that's where
Yes.
provisions of government where we allocated $75 million in FY 2021 to help offset the austerity measures that we had in place. And so $75 million was 75, right?
So is that the distribution portion that you had in the packet?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so that's for fiscal year 21.
21 for, yes. $75 million.
So clarified. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Atalik. I have a follow-up questions with regards to Tina's, or actually your mentioning of the additional FTEs. I applaud your department for making the efforts to improve our collections, and I was just curious to know what was the funding source for those additional FTEs?
We had some in ARPA, and I also had one or two funded using indirect costs or allocation to the department.
Do you have a number of the total FTEs that you have
I
got?
can get that
Okay,
exact
great.
information to you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Recognize Representative Staffler.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and welcome, Secretary Atalik. I have a lot of paper. Give me a second to find which questions. I'm going to stick to the agenda. So we're still with the fiscal report. I had a follow-up to Rep. Sablan's question. With respect to the non-reimbursable overtime, you said that officers are performing overtime on their own. And so I wanted to ask, what justification for overtime, especially if there are reduced operations, especially if they're doing it on their own? It kind of makes me wonder, does that contribute to the overall deficit and things like that? Or is that something that you're waiting for more guidance?
If I said on their own, I may have misstated that. What I mean is that the overtime that we have in the department for customs, and I can speak for customs, is we had to backfill a lot of the hours that were open at the ports and at the post office. And as well as we have also an enforcement part. We have several officers, part of the drug task force. And so these individuals had to backfill and are putting in more hours, not necessarily on their own. They're pre-approved, obviously. And sometimes in my case, we have no choice but to ensure that we provide the service. And so if it increases their overtime, then we approve that prior to the overtime being performed.
Thank you for the clarification. I was listening. I wanted to ask further regarding the annual report. One thing that stood out to me in particular was just the big discrepancy between the personal and MTIT collections versus projections. What do you think is attributed to that discrepancy? Would that be the PUA?
It is the PUA. We found an increase in our wage and salary due to PUA. Well, obviously, as we know, prior to PUA, the wage and salary levels of the Commonwealth were a lot lower than what was being issued out under PUA. I give an example. An average staff or a person that making minimum wage is earning, let's say, 400, 500 a week, but they're getting PUA of 900 a week. And so it increases that level of wage and salary. And that's where we saw increases in our collections under and then it's also the wage and salary tax, and it plays a role with NMTIT taxes.
Thank you. Makes me think of a lot of other things, but I'll stop there. looking back at your third quarter report from August, one of the questions that I had with respect to FEMA reimbursements, have we had any denials yet? Kind of like how in the past we've had denials for certain requests, expenditure requests. Is that something that you have we had additional denials since then?
I believe the main, I wouldn't say denial, just
Unallowable,
unallowed
yes.
costs, right? We submit costs for a lot of the early days of the quarantine contracts that we've had in place. And we were informed that they would only reimburse us for actual occupancy or actual rooms being occupied for quarantine. Instead, our first contract was the whole facility and paying for the whole every room, regardless of if it was occupied or not. And then we got clarification from FEMA that they would only pay for those that are occupied. And so there was days of, as you recall, way back in 2020, especially in March and early March and into April, we closed the borders for 30 days. So we didn't have any people really in quarantine other than those that we contact tracing with the early cases. So, having an amount of, let's say with the Canoa Resort, a contract stating we're paying for the whole resort for a quarantine site, but we're only going to get reimbursed for the actual rooms. And at that time, I believe we only had like 10, 15 rooms occupied. And so that was a big lessons learned there. So future contracts were based on actual, we guarantee a set number of rooms. If we go over it, then we'll pay more based on actual occupancy. So to answer your question, that's the only expenditure that we had submitted for reimbursement that I believe was not the full amount that I was anticipating.
Do we have a number of, did you already tell us the number of what we were not reimbursed with?
I don't have that. I can get that worked on.
Thank you. I'll yield for this round. Thank you. Thank you.
Recognize Representative Camacho, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice, and good morning, Mr. Secretary and your team. I just have just one simple question. Sorry if I'm late and forgive me for my ignorance. You may have probably discussed that earlier. But my question is, with regards to the travel bubble, how much does the CNMI and the source of fundings to, if you can also clarify that, whether we're using ARPA or the CARES Act for the travel bubble, but how much does the CNMI spend, and how much has the Department of Finance prepared an anticipated report, or how much do we anticipate to collect on taxes for every dollar we spend on the travel bubble?
Good question.
Yeah, good question. And I believe I kind of answered that, but I'll reiterate. We've budgeted $15 million for the South Korea trip program or the travel bubble. And we've spent a little over $8 million to date, in my recollection. I did promise the vice chair that I will submit an actual report to this body. In terms of the funding source, it was 100% ARPA for this as part of our assistance to helping our tourism industry. ARPA specifically said the tourist and hospitality industry, but we also are trying to assist other industry as we move forward in our plans to reboot our economy. I hope I answered your question.
Somewhat, yeah, somewhat. But do we have, like, for example, you guys are using $8 million so far to date, or have used, like, expended $8 million, but how much of that $8 million have reverted into BGRT tax collections?
Okay, so we don't have that analysis done. We can work on that and provide this committee with that. I don't think I'll have that analysis done by the end of the week, but we will definitely work on that as we continue the travel bubble. And we're also looking into the travel bubble with Japan. So that's I know MVA works on something similar to that, so we need to communicate with MVA and hopefully get these numbers and a report to this body.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Are you?
Thank you, Secretary Atalik. And I have a follow-up question related to the travel bubble. So, how much have we collected in hotel occupancy tax with regards to quarantine sites?
So the actual quarantine sites, in terms of those that we have contracted out under the disaster program, does not have an actual um, uh, hotel occupancy tax charged. It's included in the contract. And so we included a 10%, I would say, administrative costs on top of what was negotiated to ensure that some of these collections come to as a form of hotel occupancy tax. In terms of the travel bubble and the corridor hotels, I do not have that exact report to share. I can definitely get that information shortly this week for you, because we do have that information from PIC, World Resort, and Kensington.
That would be great. Also, what about Mariana's Resort? Since we have been using that as one of the quarantine facilities, are they getting paid?
Mariners Resort, we are, when we seek reimbursement from FEMA, we're looking at it as we're billing up to, I believe, there's a formula. As an example, let's say $180 per night. And we have logs of who we quarantine. And as part of our request for reimbursement for that facility, although we're not paying that in a contract because the government DPL owns the facility, but we are requesting for that value as a reimbursement to the CNMI government. And that should be with the public assistance office as part of a reimbursement request.
So just to make sure that I understand, are you saying that Mariana's Resort doesn't have a contract like?
No.
Yeah. Okay. And
The
is
only
it-
contracts we have with Marinas Resort is the management services and the food, the meals for the quarantine individuals in quarantine.
Is there a reason why we don't have a contract, just like with Kensington, Kanoa, and PIC?
Because the government owns the facility.
Nevertheless, it's being used to quarantine
Right.
travelers, right? So
Yeah, so we don't have a contract with ourselves, but the value of the contract or the value per room is a reimbursable, allowable reimbursable request. So we use 50 rooms times $180. We're requesting that from FEMA to reimburse us for the cost that we provided to quarantine.
And we've already started the process of submitting those reimbursements to FEMA.
I believe so. So that will be the Public
But-
Assistance Office as part of the overall reimbursement package to the Commonwealth.
Okay. Thank you. Any other members? Recognize Representative Sheila Babalta.
Thank you, Vice Chairwoman. Good morning, Secretary. Thank you for being here. My line of questions really for this round is in regards to the ARPA allocated for nonprofit organizations. And before we get into any numbers, a letter was shared from Mango, the Marianas Alliance of Non-Governmental Organizations. It was addressed to the governor on January 3rd, and in their letter, they were very detailed and specific about how many nonprofit organizations have not heard back from the administration regarding their requests. It states, it is now January 2022, and Mango organizations that have submitted ARPA applications have yet to hear news on FY 2021 or FY 2022 awards. This is not the good communication and transparency that the community needs and expects from its government. In a letter you wrote to Senator Edith regarding her request, thank you for sharing that information. You did state that for fiscal year 2021, $4 million were allocated for NGOs and only 750,000 was dispersed. 6 million is allocated for FY 2022, and you did share a list of some NGOs who were awarded, but it's nowhere near the 6 million. So my first question is in regards to the process. This list that you shared, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 NGOs who have been awarded. Can you describe the process of reviewing and awarding the NGOs and your communication to them? Because I have been receiving a lot of concerns and frustrations really from the nonprofit organizations who are filling in the gaps for our community, right? Where the government fails to provide services to our people. We are relying on our nonprofit organizations. And I'm very active in the nonprofit realm, and I have been since I moved home. So I'm very grateful for their service. So they have been expressing a lot of frustrations with no response at all to emails, no response or updates with their application, and they are not guided in any way in this regard. So they have been showing up. You know, they've had to really show up to receive any kind of information. And so I would like to start there. The review, the award, and communication with our NGOs, and who is really responsible for this. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. And we also are in support of all the NGOs. Yes, I did receive that letter from Mango. We also responded, and also with Senator Edith's request, OGA request in terms of that NGO. Keep in mind that the executive branch does not have a particular agency or organization, department or division that handles and works with NGOs directly or have a process. So we had to kind of rely on the U.S. Treasury's interim rule on nonprofits to give ourselves guidance. I had 2 people in my staff that worked on that, worked on a process, worked on an application, worked on a grant award process, and an application process. For those that seek several of these 9 or several NGOs that seek the assistance from the government, from the governor's office, without a particular process already in play. So we had to wanting to help them, but needed to make sure that we're within the U.S. Treasury's guidelines for nonprofit awards. So we sought guidance from U.S. Treasury. We came to an application process that we do have now use. We request for, and what are some of the required documents needed for NGOs to be awarded a sub-grant from the central government. So this has been done without any advertisement or notification to the community for all NGOs to have an opportunity to submit an application. I did meet, and we were there with a Mango luncheon, and I did share the process as we're still working, trying to get this ironed out. Today, Um, we have many applications that have come in. We've asked Mango to assist us of any of the organizations. Here is the application process. Here's the U.S. Treasury guidelines that guides us to award them, and some of the questions that application process that we have for nonprofits. We ask them to submit this to us so that we can review it. We review it internally in my office. I have an ARPA team that includes also several members that are here that review and make sure that um, the U.S. Treasury guidelines for nonprofit awards is checkmarked, whether they submitted a DUNS number, a SAMS ID, their 5013C, a determination letter from IRS, and so forth. We will go through that initial application process. And once it's all that, we also have, this is also submitted to the governor's office, my office and the governor's office. So I'm not sure on the governor's office side who, if he has anyone reading the submission, but we read the requests and then we review our total budget. We review and make sure that their requests, their spending plan, and their letter of request for funding meets the U.S. guidelines in terms of can't be for construction. It can't be for, so we make sure that it's within those, some of those guidelines. And some of
Secretary,
those,
how long does that take? How long does the review take?
it will take about, I would say, if there was no other things on the plate of my staff, it can take someone, if they're just focused on it, it should take a week
So
or
you have two
less
people in that. You
in my
have two
team.
people who have
Yes,
been responsible for this.
yes.
So there have been applicants since August with no
Mhm.
response at all. Is
I find that, and we can maybe offline, or you're more than welcome to share with
Yeah.
me which organizations, but I believe we've communicated with all applicants that we have in our office.
Okay.
We've communicated with each one of them. Unless I'm not aware of a certain NGO, I would ask kindly to please share that so that we can assist.
okay. And then for FY 2021, 4 million was allocated for NGOs. Only 750,000 was dispersed. What happened to the rest of the funding?
Probably not all NGOs requested at that time.
Yeah.
So that was the part of the spending plan
Mm-hmm.
for FY 2021.
Mm-hmm. So
But
does it carry over to
yes,
FY
it does.
2022?
We're planning. We
Okay.
anticipate
And then
to carry that over.
okay. And to date, only, let's see. Okay, so for FY 2022, there are several NGOs who were awarded and have not received any disbursements. What's the holdup?
They need to submit a request for drawdown.
Okay.
So they should be aware. I'm very certain that my team is sharing with them what they need to do to get dispersed. They
And
can't.
only two people on the team for this?
Yes.
To respond? Okay,
Yes.
okay. So
And asking, working with them to get the proper documents. A lot of the documents, because when we receive and we award, we also have to upload the information to U.S. Treasury's system. And so we got to enter that in to make sure that all the requirements we need to do under U.S. Treasury is in. We also need to ask, they need to submit a request for drawdown and as part of their requests.
right.
And then they process it, and then we release the funds for those NGOs.
Right. Okay.
Usually in a quarterly, similar to like an allotment, we give them a quarter, up to the quarter amount of the award. So let's say if it's $100,000 award, we allow them to draw down the first 25,000. It doesn't mean that they have to wait to the next quarter to request for another 25 or more. They just need to show that they've spent the current
Mhm.
tranche of funds and showing us and making sure that it's within their spending plan. And then another request due to projects they have or
And do you have a template for the instructions for drawdown
Yes.
requests? And
Yes, we do.
that's also been provided to the
Yes.
NGOs?
Yes.
Okay. So the two people that you have servicing, this $10 million for NGOs, is that all that they're focused on?
No,
Okay.
but I am,
Have you considered building that team?
yes, I am.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That's all. Thanks.
Oh, that's right.
Anybody else? Recognize Representative Babalta.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Good morning, Chairman and colleagues. Good morning, Secretary and your team. You mentioned earlier, in line with Congresswoman Tina Sablon's questions with respect to the deficit that occurred in the last fiscal year, primarily due to the law enforcement agencies. You mentioned that specific to customs, the Division of Customs, um, those were deemed non-reimbursable. Is that correct that I heard you?
No,
In terms of overtime
no,
to backfill
the backfill has not been submitted for reimbursement.
and do you plan to? or-
Of course I do.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's just that occurred since last year, right?
last year, yeah.
Yeah.
We're still in the, disaster period allowable by FEMA.
Okay.
So we can still bill back to March of 2020. If we see that there's expenditures that are allowable for reimbursement, we can still submit that for reimbursement.
Okay. And when do you plan to do that?
I'm still waiting on guidance from PA office to share with me. I know they've had meetings with FEMA. In fact, the good news is that FEMA is sending a couple people specifically to work with the PA office here on island to ensure that we get the proper guidance for paperwork and processing documents to get reimbursed.
Thank you. And now with respect to the travel bubble, you mentioned that 15 million was budgeted for the Korea
Mhm.
travel bubble program. Can we expect that more funds will be committed for the Japan bubble program, travel bubble?
The Marinus Visitors Authority is asking for the same amount of a budget for the travel bubble program with Japan. And so, although if we approve an additional 15 million, does not mean that they need to spend all $15 million. As we see in the current South Korean bubble, we budgeted 15 million, but we've only probably spent a little over 8 million so far.
Do you require, let's say, an ROI analysis from MVA? What can we expect from all these spending? And is there a targeted time frame where we can see a return on these investments, 15 million for a limited travel program? And do we see when we can break even, or when we can even anticipate any return on that investment?
That's a similar question to Rep Camacho in terms of what analysis do we have that shows the every dollar spent, what's the return in terms of tax collections. I don't have that answer right now, Rep Babalta. I will make sure that I get that. I do know that MVA works with a group that analyzes and does calculations on for every tourist from certain markets, how much that helps in BGR and in wage and salary. So they have a current system and an analytics that does that. I will need to get an update on that.
Thank you. I'd appreciate taking a look at that. So I was confused about what you replied with respect to the hotel occupancy tax. You said 10% was incorporated into the contract. Can you explain to us exactly what happens when we use, let's say, like Canoa, for example? which has been the longest opened care site. Can you help us explain
Yeah.
by explaining what
So-
happens in these contracts and how the HOT, the hotel occupancy tax, is realized by the CNMI government?
I can speak for the hotel occupancy tax portion of it because that was my input into the contracts with the hotels that were being utilized for quarantine. Since our hotel occupancy tax is about 10%, I asked if we can build in the contract that when we do get reimbursed for the expenditures that we have for these quarantine sites, that we receive 10% more than what of reimbursements that could help our general funds, similar to how hotel occupancy tax operates or works. And so it is not, the question from Vice Chair was how much collections have we received? And we won't see it classified as hotel occupancy tax. However, we realize as a government, the revenues that we get from these reimbursements is a form of a small revenue portion. So, but in terms of the corridor hotel quarantine sites from the bubble, those are marked as hotel occupancy tax per each room. And so we have those numbers. I just don't have the numbers today to report on how much collections do we have for hotel occupancy tax or BGRs derived from the use of these hotels as part of the travel bubble.
Thank you. So the owners of these hotels are not the ones paying for it. It's you get it reimbursed from the federal government. Is that correct?
For the true quarantine sites like Kanoa.
Yes, yes.
That's true.
Hmm.
And they're aware of it. So it's nothing, I'm here publicly speaking about it. It's not something the FEMA is not aware. The PA office and the chairman of the task
Wow.
force discussed this information with FEMA and in putting together the contracts for
Mhm.
these quarantine sites. So my question and input is, how do we realize these facilities normally generate hotel occupancy tax for the Commonwealth? And so they said that we cannot charge a hotel occupancy tax because it's a quarantine. It's not a transient, like a traditional transient tourist operation. But we are welcome to include it as part of the overall contract.
Thank you for that clarification. With respect to these salary cap exemptions, that certifications that we get from the governor, we get approximately 3 to 5 a month, and the average salary above what is allowed by statute is generally in the thousands. Let's say 20,000 for one individual. I, I'm curious, where do these sorts of funding come from? And they're all over the government. We don't just get it for attorneys; we get it for individuals who are not attorneys. The latest example would be Mr. Will Castro, the chief of staff to the governor. He's not an attorney, to my knowledge, and like I said, the average excess that we see is around 20,000 per individual above the salary cap. Where is the source of funding for these?
So every department, we've given them their budget using ARPA to help subsidize their current operations to the levels of 2019 budget. And so that's in the provisions of government. If they're hiring someone, first of all, I'm not aware of the number that's coming to to this body, but when the routing of the NOPA comes to my office, we make sure that it's within their current budget allocation for this fiscal year. And if it's within budget, and if it's approved, we approve it. It's coming from, majority of it is coming from ARPA and backfilling, or they're not budget reviews for their one FTE approval, and two, if there's a budget for it. And if they justify that they are within their budget whether they're not filling another FTE or not. I'm not sure how the departments are handling it, but you are right. The funding source is coming from mainly from ARPA.
Thank you for clarifying that. And my last question, if I may, of the 10 million in ARPA funds allocated for NPOs and NGOs, how much has already been dispersed total, and who are these NPOs, and how much did each get? Are you able to tell us that?
We have that information. I'm able to submit that to this body. Yeah, I just don't have that with me because I came prepared with the list that Vice Chair came with, asked me to come and report on. But I definitely can get that list to you.
Thank you. We would appreciate it.
Yeah, and a lot of it is based on their actual requests, NGO requesting, and we evaluate as asked by Congresswoman Babalta, and how we award that. Majority of them gets awarded.
Okay.
They're fully
One
done.
last question. I'm sorry, it just came to mind. We received information that 121,000, nearly 122,000, has been paid for the attorneys that were representing witnesses in the JGO committee. What was the source of funding for that? Was it, the governor has constantly or consistently renewed the emergency declaration granting you 100% reprogramming authority. Where did these funds, suddenly appear from?
I believe majority of it is in their provisions of government allocation, where they have funding available to the level of 2019 budget. I did report that amount to this body for your information, except one attorney hasn't submitted their invoice, and unfortunately, it is all coming from their ARPA provisions of government as part of their operation. So it's money that they are unfortunately unable to utilize elsewhere.
Okay. It's interesting that 122,000 was, utilized, and all we got was, I don't recall, but so be it. Thank you. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you, Rep. Selena. I actually have a follow-up question to her. So I'm assuming that the attorney's fees for these witnesses were not part of fiscal year 2022 budget, correct?
Not part of the general funds budget, that's correct.
Right. And so I guess the question that she was alluding to was, where did these funds taken from, or like, where was the funding source coming from?
I can get the actual account information, but my assumption, as I shared with Congresswoman Babauta, is that it is most likely coming from their provisions of government account that they have from funding funding levels of 2019, and it helps them operate at that level prior to the pandemic, which we had at that time, 200 and over 200, was it $256 million budget versus the 144 we have today.
And just to clarify, will ARPA funds be used to backfill any of the funds that were reallocated to fund for the
Legal?
attorney's fees? Yes.
No, it's using their own budget
using their
that
own
they
budget.
currently have. And every budget has been already identified through ARPA for provisions of government, which we submitted as part of the budget package that was approved. And it shows how much each department is getting
Got it.
as a backfill.
Anybody else? Oh, recognize Representative Babalta.
Thank you. Just one last question. You keep mentioning provisions of government. I'm sorry. Can you explain to us what that is? Is it a slush fund? Is it?
No, it's not. It is. In ARPA, Section 602C is a provision in the ARPA for the territories and states. Specifically in this 602 is for territories. And 602C is provisions of government, meaning these are funds that are calculated for the loss of revenue due to the pandemic that the states and municipalities could use this funds to backfill, as we use that term, or to subsidize the current budget to a level prior to the pandemic. So it's loss of revenue, loss of budget cuts that we've had, austerity. That's where earlier was asked, how much did we allocate in the provisions of government for FY 2021? And what is reported here is 75 million by department and division. For FY 2022, it's at 175. Now, there's a formulary from US Treasury that calculates how much we can use. We can't just arbitrarily say out of the 481, 400,000 is provisions of government. I would love to, honestly, but we're binded by the rules of US Treasury, and that formulary puts us, in fact, just under the amounts that we have, but we're still working with US Treasury to ensure and get that we don't spend above that formula that they have published that we need to abide by. So I hope I answered your question. So it is treated like general fund, but only that amount. The other funding out of ARPA for nonprofits that we've allocated, I cannot say, let me take this 5 million and put it in provisions in government. I'm not allowed based on the US guidelines, US Treasury guidelines. I specifically and reported to US Treasury that $10 million is going to NGOs. That's what I'm sticking with, and we have until December of 2024 to get that done and given out. Yeah,
Thank you for that clarification.
thank you.
In line with the ARPA funds, you had submitted a spending plan for ARPA, right? Are we on track with that, or are there any deviations from the spending plan?
The only change based on US Treasury guidelines is section 604, which is the Capital Projects Fund. And we, prior to the US Treasury guidelines, we anticipated that to spread among all the precincts for water, sewer, or broadband and communications. The guidance came out, and I think in anticipation of the now passed infrastructure bill from the federal government, they said that we can only use 604 funds only for broadband. So 100% of the $14.2 million that we received in 604 funds is now all for broadband. And so that's the only major change, Vice Chair. We're doing a review as part of the budget process that we're trying to get to you on April 1st. We're trying to review where we're at and if we need to make any changes to report to, obviously, this body for the FY 2023 spending plan.
Thank you for that. Anybody else?
Thank you, Vice. I think in the interest of time, first off, I just want to say thank you, Secretary, for providing pretty much or majority of what was listed on the request. And while we did just get it yesterday and haven't had the ample time to review, I think members will just quickly go over one of the more pressing issues that you're aware of right now. And then after you've had time to review all the documents that were submitted, we can circle back and request that the Secretary comes in. But I think, Secretary, I think one of the main areas of concerns right now and what's on the list, if you can briefly go over the parameters and how premium pay was distributed and calculated. I think that's one of the most pressing issues that the committee is facing right now.
Thank you, Chairman Manglonia. If you look, I know number 5 of the list, I provided with the committee our criteria and coming up with how we took care of premium pay. In there, for those that were receiving $5,000 in premium pay, the the rationale was we needed to help compensate our true frontline workers, those that were in the trenches during this whole pandemic. And we identified using our disaster accounts and those that have a Category B form with Homeland Security to show that they're working at either the quarantine sites or and all these in order to get reimbursement for frontline workers through FEMA, they must submit a Category B form. And so we know that these people that filled these forms out that got COVID pay, as we deem COVID overtime pay, these are the people that are in line for the $5,000. We put some criterias to ensure and make sure that it were as fair as possible in identifying that what that meant. We took a deadline of up to September 30 at the time when we started processing. Those that are employed, worked in the disaster, or have a Cat B form, worked 40 hours or more. We utilize a 40-hour minimum. That means they worked at least a full week in their assistance in helping us with the pandemic. Because we've had in the early stages, I'll just be honest, we've had a lot of people volunteer to help with the quarantine sites. And when we got our first couple positives, they all ran away. And I don't blame them. We all didn't know how to expect and what this COVID was really. And so there's a lot that stuck around. We got more people, recruited more people to work the quarantine sites, work the airport, and so forth. And so we decided on a 40-hour work week. I mean, a minimum of 40 hours. And from March 2020 to basically the end of September 30, 2021. And so we had a list of all the employees under 1699J. And then at the same time, I realized, we were wanting to release premium pay as soon as we can. I didn't realize that we also had DPS, DFEMS, corrections, and CODA having their own direct account with FEMA, with PA office. So their employees were not part of the 1699J. Some were because the early days of the disaster account, everyone was in this big pot of this account that tracked all the disaster spending. And so subsequently, right after, we included them and their list of employees. They all had Cat B forms, just not directly with Homeland. They had their own with PA office. And so we got all these people for the 5,000. And then we also identified and worked based on working in guidelines with OPM, asking, in order for us to do the premium pay, do we need to do a NOPA, a personal action to give it to them? And their guidance to us was we did not, but we were only subject to the executive branch. We didn't have the authority for the other branches of government or the municipalities. So therefore, the first batch were mainly 99% was just executive branch. And then we got more better guidance from OPM and the Civil Service Commission. And then that's where we're starting. To this day, we're working on a pretty decent batch this week to take care of a lot of people that kind of were lost in the shuffle, so to speak. I don't want to say they were not do it, but there were some departments that I'm talking mainly to get the 5,000, because we also did a sweep and gave everyone 1,000. But then there was deserving staff that truly were part of the disaster, helped with some areas of the disaster that were deemed qualified for the 5,000. A great example is our DNAP, right? A lot of the food stamps, and they were there all day, all night, trying to distribute aid to our people. They all got 1,000, but because they didn't really have a frontline FEMA Category B form provided. So we're making these corrections and we're assisting them. So those employees will be getting the additional 4,000. In terms of those that are that receive $1,000, the governor decided that when we open back up, we're still in the pandemic. We're providing essential services to our community that they may not be the frontliners, so to speak, but they're deserving of a premium pay, which is allowable under the ARPA rules. And so we gave every employee $1,000 as part of their premium pay. I am still receiving letters and responding to the mayors, to the municipal councils, and other departments on making sure that if they felt that they had a staff member truly deserving of being the frontliner or the 5,000 pay, then we have a discussion, and we're not blanketing and saying no. The criteria mainly has if they have to be employed with us prior to 9/30/2001, because we also have, as part of our spending plan, a possibility of premium pay for FY 2022, depending on how much we've spent so far and what's available to help pay. That will be for those in FY 2022. So there's a lot of people that were employed in October, November that may have not received premium pay. It's because they were not part of that cutoff. And so we're pretty much sticking to that guideline. I can answer any questions you have regarding premium pay.
Recognize Representative Probst.
Thank you. Secretary, good morning, and to you and your staff, thank you for coming in today and answering our questions today, for being so candid. And you showed up without an attorney, so I want to applaud you. Sorry, bad joke. I'm going to get killed for that. Mr. Secretary, the premium pay issue has been brought up to all of us, and concerns have been raised by our constituents for each and every one of us in the House. I can assure you of that. I know it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, chances are your constituents have contacted you guys. We all know this. We've talked about it. The concerns have been with regard to this premium pay, and let's just put it out there. Of course, there are those who we will say that deserved it, that were in the front line, as you mentioned, the frontline workers, right? The true frontline. But let's not kid ourselves. There are those who received 5,000 and 1,000 who were in administrative positions that were not directly in the front line. And so those who were in the front line were concerned that how did they only receive 1,000 minus taxes or whatever, and then others got that huge bonus. For example, at CUC, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think almost all the employees got $5,000 premium pay. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that they don't deserve it, but we also have to look at others who were there. We talk about essential services that were rendered. Let me tell you about essential services right now. If you guys recall, Mr. Secretary, that one of the most essential services that was provided was the stores being open. And I know that this is going to say, well, that's semantics. They're not government employees. But I'm just saying that we are paying premium pay and having no issues paying certain people. Some that, like, again, were administrators that were not in the direct front line. And then we have essential services that were provided to all of us at a time when there was no vaccine, such as stores. Cashiers come up to us. There are constituents too. People that were pumping gas, all of these private sector employees. And they always ask, what do we get? Why is the private sector so neglected? So that's a frustration that I'm speaking to you about from my constituents who come to me and express their frustrations on that. It seems very unfair. And I would like to ask, Mr. Secretary, has this conversation ever come up with the governor as to how do we address these private sector employees who risked it all in the direct front line, every day providing valuable services. If the stores were closed, what would we do? Could we shop? Could we eat? Are we going to have to fend for ourselves? They provided critical services, and I think that a lot of them are just not thanked enough. But they still receive nothing. I also want to talk about another question to this is the 9 firefighters that were fired because they refused to get the vaccine. Have they been paid the premium pay? And if not, why not? If anybody deserves this, it should be those who were in the front line directly at the time when there was no vaccine available. Whether they refuse the vaccine or not is mute. There is moot. That's not the point. The point is they did provide a valuable service, and they were direct frontline workers. So, have they received it? If not, will they receive it? And when will they receive it? Thank you.
Congressman Probst, you had a lot of questions there. So, I mean, I try to take notes and I'll try to answer and let me know if I missed out anything, okay? As far as the frontliners, and you mentioned the private sector, I agree with you. The private sector is vital to our community as well as for our government resources, our revenues. But also, as I shared with, I have also shared with the governor, we're looking at, and also in the cabinet level, a lot of programs were available through CARES, through all these or these federal laws that were passed to help the private sector for their frontliners. The PPP program, everyone, basically it's a grant program to pay for it's a paycheck, payment program. And the private sector was able to have that. We had restaurants having funding available, grants available to help them pay for their employees in the front lines. As part of ARPA, we've set aside for CETA $20 million to help small businesses. They definitely can apply for these grants under the CETA program. SBA has some funds available from ARPA to help with these small businesses. I'm not saying I just don't have enough funding, and I don't have the numbers for the private sector to provide every private sector out there a premium pay. I do want to say that I've helped all households by helping with their utility and giving a stimulus that helped everyone, government and private sector. So we're trying our best to help everyone. And so I am not challenging or opposing to different people's definition of frontliners, but yes, in the private sector, a lot of programs are available for the private sector to avail for their employees when we were going through this pandemic. As far as the premium pay for those that you mentioned, the 9 firefighters, we are in our next batch, the last batch, is we're going to put together a premium pay package for all those that were working with us for some reason or another, that they've left government service, but they were also part of helping our community get through this pandemic. And so we're looking at a program of paying all those that worked with us prior to September 30, 2021, a minimum of $1,000 in pandemic pay. Here's the issue. We need to get the information. They're out of our payroll already. So we're going to be asking every department, and also probably the help of OPM, to get information on all these people that worked with us, because I don't have them in the system anymore, and I need to pay them like a one-time vendor. So we are working on that, Congressman. I should have that probably done in the next couple of weeks for those that were previously employed with us.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I do want to note that, yes, there has been available federal funding for small businesses. And I talk about small businesses because you would agree with me that that's the backbone of every economy, correct?
Yes.
But it is these small businesses that struggle the most. And if you talk to them, any loan or anything that they get is just to try to keep their doors open. We are talking about a very difficult time, and as you said, unprecedented, right? With COVID, and it's unpredictable. We don't know what the future brings. We hope for the best, but we need to prepare for the worst. So there is frustration even from the small business owners with regard to certain things, um, and and I do want to ask, will you be providing us the list of all who receive premium pay?
I certainly can provide this. It's public documents.
Thank you. If you
Yes.
could get that to the
Mhm.
to the chair, and then we could be provided copies. That
Yes.
would be the easiest way, because again, the public is concerned, and if we had names and positions, they could understand how did this person get it, the premium pay, but I did not get it. And again, this is what we are getting from our constituents. I was, for example, they'll say I was there. And they tell us the dates that they were there. They didn't receive it, and then some of them, like I said, only received 1,000, and then they have somebody that they know was never there, or something, and they're asking how did they get the full amount or the premium pay. So that again, that's concerns about fairness, and certainly when we get the list, that'll be transparent and we can discuss that. So I appreciate that. At this point, I will yield and I'll open it up to other members. Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Ben. Recognize Representative Ben Camacho.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Secretary, welcome. It's a two-part question. Um, can you tell us the exact date when the ARPA funds expire?
Yes. The ARPA funds has a December 2024 expiration date or grant period ending. Now, this is for those for all projects we can request from U.S. Treasury for a 2-year extension on any available ARPA funds. However, the extension is only and will be granted as far as today's interim rules for those that are projects that have been encumbered and that just needs a couple more years to complete the project. So it's not for new programs or new funding or, oh, we have available funds, now let's spend it on this and that. Everything needs to be spent by December of 2024.
Okay, and the follow-up question for that, and this is basically about employment. Is there a plan in place for continued employment for employees hired under the ARPA funds?
The ARPA funds, obviously, when they're all hired, employees under the ARPA funds are all hired under a limited term agreement. And so they're aware that it's based on funding availability. The question you have is there a plan? There is a plan, and there's hope that as we rebuild our economy, we bring back tourism, that these people, we can help them, whether it's in the government sector or the private sector, help them get employment, gainful employment after their contract runs out or we run out of funding or ending December 2024.
Okay, thank you for that. Fair enough. I yield. Thank you.
Recognize Representative Staffler.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Secretary. I have a few follow-up questions to the premium pay. You mentioned that one of the opportunities for the private sector was PPP. But I wanted to clarify, does PPP allow for premium pay?
The PPP at the time, and I believe they're working on another kind of round of it, was a paycheck protection program, meaning you apply for a loan, but you show that you pay your employees. That's a form of,
But does it include premium pay? Because that's different.
well, premium pay was after the
After.
PPP program. So
So
my bringing it up is that there's ample resources to help small businesses get through the pandemic as well, and that those are opportunities that they avail of that we didn't have as a government or as a territory.
well, with respect to premium pay for other agencies, like for example, CUC, it's not listed here specifically. So would you say that any other autonomous agencies or programs also received allocation from ARPA for premium pay?
They did through us.
Okay.
Now, for example, CPA, CUC, NMC requested for premium pay allocation from ARPA for their employees. We cannot dictate how they do it. They gave us a request and the governor approved it. And then we remitted monies to them and they paid their employees.
Do they have different guidance than what was given to us for premium pay?
No, we asked them to follow our guidance.
Did
Oh,
PSS
no, no, no.
request?
I apologize, Congresswoman. We give them our guidance, but it's up to their board to decide how they're going to give their premium pay. We've had other semi-autonomous groups dictate, or not dictate, but identified the amount they wanted to give each group of employees they had in their organization. And so we give them the money that they requested.
Did PSS request?
PSS did not request.
Okay. Thank you for all of these. My next question is with respect to the power. One of the things many of our constituents have come to us about is why was it that water was not included with respect to that? For example, there are many homes who do not even have power, but they do have water, but they were not able to avail of this service. And many people have shared, like, people who choose not to have power often are maybe the most in need, yet they were not even given an opportunity to avail of this very, very needed service. So can you answer to that, please?
Yes, I can. The original program, we use guidance. This is not a new program. It happened in 2016, I believe. 20. Nonetheless, we used and worked. I worked with CUC on putting together the guidance on how we're going to roll this utility stimulus program. Yes, you're correct. The water customers were not included if they only had a water account. But I'm happy to share that after hearing from CUC, hearing back from their clients, and more and more were complaining and asking why not. They submitted to the governor's office and myself to ask for either additional funding or can we include them. So we did. They did a fiscal impact and we did include them. So if you have constituents that are still not avail of that, they can either contact CUC customer service. They should be able to assist them on that. And then, or they can contact, Miss Betty Terlai is in charge of that program, or at least my contact. So she can be asked directly to make sure and ensure that they are included.
So you're saying that now it is an allowable cost, so that
Yes.
CUC should do that.
And,
It's not going to be an automatic thing for the
It
water
should be.
customers?
It should be.
It should be.
But
When will that be?
It should have been done.
It should have. Okay, so
if
they
it
should
hasn't-
check.
If it hasn't been done, to please
Okay.
check with the CUC customer service.
Thank you. I'm glad that CUC has seen, the need. I think especially our constituents who only have water
Mhm.
are some of the most people in need. Water is an essential service.
We also allowed for this stimulus that if they didn't have a power account, that they could use this to their account to pay for the deposits that they have for power that they need, or their whatever fees associated to getting power or water. Some have power but no water. In this case, you're asking, they have water, no power.
Yeah.
But yes, all customers in terms of residential are qualified, and we allowed for it.
Thank you. I just want to say I really appreciate that there is more effort to look and review who did not receive the 5K premium pay, especially if they had a Cat B form. I am aware of at least one person that I know who did not receive the full 5K. And so I will be following up for that person maybe in next week.
Mhm.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. And with respect to the guidance itself, who designed the parameters? Who was involved in this document?
It was, to be honest, mainly myself and my ARPA team. We've been researching different states and territories on how they're applying their premium pay, and we've looking at the constraints of the amounts that we have allocated for premium pay, and we came up with this and approved by the governor.
Okay. Thank you. I believe that I yield. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Staffler, and I recognize Representative Lizana.
Thank you, Vice Chairwoman. Just a follow-up question with regards to the question that my colleague over there, Rep. Staffler, had asked you questions. There was a constituent who had an open account around October for the meter, and then the meter start active around December. Isn't the stimulus came out in October? And why is that? Because the meter was not running, that this individual not qualified. Can you answer to that? I mean, isn't that because the meter wasn't working, or is it because the account was already open? How do you explain that, sir? Thank you.
Geez, I wish I could answer for CUC, but I know part of the guidance for the utility was they needed to be an active account, and it may have fallen in that. But believe me, I I don't. We want to be inclusive of everyone to help everyone. We're not trying to single out any um, ratepayer for CUC. They need to submit, and I asked CUC to please consider, and just if you need guidance or requests from my office, if you need additional fund, they're within the funding that we gave them for this. So I tell them, please help all residentials. I know in the early stage, we had to have a guide to have in place so that they can program their system to credit all these accounts. But we found days and weeks after that a lot were not included, as Rep. Staffler was mentioning. So we want to make sure that we're inclusive. We're trying to help all households. And if they're not being assisted, please share with me, and I can ask CUC to ensure as part of the program that they get assisted. Yeah.
Recognize Representative Tina Sablan and then Joel Camacho.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. On the premium pay, I had a few follow-up questions. Could you explain or clarify what was the basis for OPM's guidance that premium pay bonuses could only be distributed to executive branch employees? I don't see that anywhere in the Treasury guidelines.
No, I don't think we asked them in terms of guidance with do we need to do a notice of personnel action to give them the premium pay. For the overtime pay or the COVID pay, we needed an action. We needed to show they have a Cat B form. These are the employees, staff that are going to be getting COVID pay on top of their normal pay or whatnot. And so we needed an action for that. So we asked them for guidance, and they said, no, you don't need a notice of personal action, but you're only subject to the executive branch. That's where their guidance was. Not necessary that we can only pay executive branch.
Okay, but on the
For
question of who should NOPAs be
right,
issued for the premium pay,
right,
they
and
said no for executive branch employees.
no, we didn't
Okay.
have to do it, but
Okay.
we were only restricted to the executive branch.
I see. So you're not restricted from including other agencies that
No,
did
we're
not
not.
receive, and you're not restricted from including the private sector either.
We are not.
Okay. Now, it sounds like finance relied on the departments and agencies to submit the data that you needed to determine who would get premium pay, right? So why couldn't finance adopt a similar process for the private sector and for agencies that haven't received premium pay bonuses for their employees?
We're just buying it as part of our spending plan. I only allocated the 10 million out of for premium pay. And so I'm just following our spending plan. Not to say that, as you shared, um, it's something that we can look into. I'm just trying to see and fit within our ARPA spending plan and how much we allocated for premium pay.
So how much has been paid out in total then in premium pay bonuses?
I asked last week for a update, and at the moment we've spent about 6.1 million, I believe, 6.1 or 6.2 million.
Okay. And you mentioned that there are still bonuses that are
Yes.
being processed.
Yes, I think we're processing another like a little over 1.1 million more for those that receive one, but they justified they should get five, and all this, and then also responding to agencies that submitted requests for and the municipal councils of Rototinian and the mayor's office in Rototinian, because like I shared, our first main big batch was only for the executive branch, and even within the executive branch, we're, we were we were shared concerns of who should, as Rep. Probst was mentioning, some got five, some got one. They should get five, and so we're working through all that. And keep in mind, we're premium pay, and it's not something I can just pay tomorrow. We're still doing payroll through the JD Edwards system until we implement the HCM, Human Capital Management module of our Tyler Munis system. We're expecting to go live in July. We're doing tests in March and April to ensure that when we go live in July, then we start doing payroll through Munis. We can only do one batch at a time in JD. So once payroll opens up the batch to do payroll for the government, we got to wait till they're done, and it takes days to make sure everything's entered for payroll. And so I can't just pay someone a premium pay right away because we're still utilizing that for our payroll.
Okay.
And so once payroll's done, we work on a batch to take care of premium pay, which is why I mentioned we're working on that batch now.
Okay. And could you explain the huge disparity between 5,000 and 1,000 in bonuses? Where did that decision come from?
Like I said, it was a recommendation from my ARPA team, myself, coming and putting together different scenarios and trying to be within our current budget or spending plan allocation.
And ultimately, the people who determined which employees for each department received 5,000 versus 1,000, was that the department head?
No, originally our guidance was based on our Cap B forms and the disaster account, 1699J, business unit 1699J. If they receive COVID pay using this disaster account, they were frontliners. Now, there could have been admin people being paid in that. I just see a big list. I don't see employee names going through. I see employee numbers. But
Okay.
we look at this list and say, okay, these are all the people that worked disaster, got COVID pay. We show the minimum of 40 hours, pay them all five.
And did any government officials who are subject to statutory salary caps receive premium pay bonuses?
I am not sure.
Any cabinet members?
I am not sure. I mean, some are requesting, but I have not processed.
You have not processed
I have
any
not
cabinet
processed.
member
I have
premium
not.
pays? Okay. And you mentioned some independent programs also receive premium pay bonuses. Were you referring to the autonomous agencies that you mentioned? CPA, NMC, CUC, or are there other programs?
Other programs, some programs like Scholarship Office submitted a request saying they helped take care of, during the pandemic, our getting checks out to our students.
Mhm.
And so it wasn't 5,000. We'll give you 1,000. You'll get the 1,000.
Okay. What about CHC?
CHC, we've already remitted to them over I want to say 6.2 million, or it could be 5.8. These numbers are coming in mind. I have the exact numbers.
Mhm.
We provided CHCC 2 batches. They were the very first, and they had their formularies and their analysis on how they're going to do it, depending on job class. And they're doing it per hour. So every pay period, people are getting a premium pay above their current salary. So they're paying it pay period to pay period, and we gave them the full amount of their analysis. And I think that's for this fiscal year.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you. I yield for that line of questioning, Madam Chair.
Recognize Representative, oh, sorry, it was Joel and then you.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Vice. Just a follow-up question on the question I asked earlier, or maybe not a follow-up, but is there a limitation, or thank you, Mr. Secretary, is there a limitation on the amount of stimulus money that is allowable through the Department of Treasury for issuance for like the stimulus cards that you did recently?
No, you're pretty much binded by your spending plan. And part of assisting households, we had budgeted an example, um, you know, $30 million to help households. And so we did the stimulus that cost us 25 million, the local stimulus. And then we did the utility stimulus with the CUC, and that was $7.5 million. And so we can do more. It's just we got to report it and revise that with the U.S. Treasury as what we submitted on how we're going to spend the full 481 million.
Okay. By chance, Mr. Secretary, do you have an analysis on how much taxes were generated from the local stimulus cards or the CUC for that matter?
Great question. I don't have those analysis done, but I will inquire and have that done and share that with you and this committee.
The reason why I ask is I think it's important that to know or to get a side-by-side comparison with the aids that we give our community versus like the travel bubble, for example, so we can maximize the extent of the aid that can generate BGRT as a result. So maybe if that's something that you guys can put together and maybe share with the committee, how much so far have we generated in taxes for the travel bubble versus how much we've generated for like the local stimulus, and if it shows that we're generating more locally and we're able to help each household, then maybe that's something that we need to start revising the ARPA spending plan to focus more on like local stimulus. If that has a greater impact to our economy, because the ARPA was given to assist our economy, and if the travel bubble for that matter is not really making as great as an impact as it should, then maybe we need to redivert back and look at that. That's a recommendation. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Recognize Representative Selena Babauta.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Um, with respect to the premium pay, I was listening to what you were saying, and those, correct me if I'm wrong, in my understanding of what you were saying, you said employees were previously paid under a business unit 1699J, and that's how these premium pay went out. You don't see names, you don't see you only see employee numbers. So, and then you also mentioned, I think, the scholarship office that they were able to justify, um, that they did work during the pandemic or during the shutdown, in getting our, scholarship checks out to students abroad who need that, assistance. So were they also being paid previously under this business unit?
A good question. No. So I used 1699J as our guide to define what is
Essential employee.
essential, frontline employees
Okay.
in this disaster. Because we know that all those in this business unit, all employees being paid are also going into a list that we're requesting for reimbursement from from FEMA disaster account. And so we use that as a guide. What I mentioned, other independent programs, other agencies, after we released the first big batch, has come up and justified or requested for their employees or their certain employees got this and they really strongly feel they should get the five, then we review those requests and look at if it's within the guidelines that we have and communication back and forth with the department head, then we make a decision whether they get the one or the five.
So
But we just might try to stay within the criteria to
to
be
a,
fair to everyone.
to a great extent, then you have latitude
Hmm.
of who gets paid premium pay or not.
Hmm.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. My next question deals with the retiree bonus that the Senate just passed, and we've been going back and forth with the Senate, and frankly, the House of Representatives gets blamed for the delay in this. But you know, even in the passage at the Senate recently, they didn't identify any funding source to double the retiree bonus. We want to get this bonus out. And the Senate approved it without any funding source to cover the remaining 500 that we already identified. What is your can you enlighten us what your thoughts are on this?
Mhm.
How are we as House members supposed to, we had MVA screaming in the papers that we took their money, but we had no choice. We had to identify a funding source. The Senate did it when they passed the resolution first, and they still haven't identified a funding source. Now the House will have to either reject it until we can identify a funding source for it and go into conference with the Senate members and ask them where do they expect the House to reprogram these funds from. And then we're going to have departments coming to us, knocking on our doors saying, why did you take our budget? So can you please enlighten us as to how this can be funded with the recent action of the Senate? Thank you.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share some thoughts on it. I'm sharing personal thoughts. I'm not part of the legislative body from either house. However, I will share that I believe after reading what the Senate had revised, they're also allowing or part of it is giving the governor 100% reprogramming authority to identify and provide latitude to increase it from $5 to $1,000. I've met with OMB earlier and this morning, actually, before this meeting, and I asked that I need to see and look at all departments, divisions, and where can we find and identify in the general fund, not ARPA, in the general fund allocation, where can we find the if this is doubling it, 2.6 million to pay the retirees the $1,000? I asked her to go ahead and check. Obviously, in the original letter, I said we had general funds allocated under the Department of Finance. The reason I shared and opted to utilize my account was because I know in the ARPA side of things, I was given a pretty decent increase that I can live within to keep our department running, and that any general funds from the Department of Finance, and then I also can zero out and reprogram all the governor's accounts in terms of the general funds account, because he also has some ARPA allocations that he could use for operations. So we're identifying. I don't have the answer today, but my thoughts are, if given 100%, if the governor is given 100% reprogramming authority, as he's had in the last several years, then we can identify that and report that as part of their version, is to report where we're finding the funds. So I was just assigned just this morning meeting with OMB to identify those areas. When I mentioned that in the letter, with the governor's letter, is that we can backfill. We cannot use ARPA funds to pay for retiree bonuses. However, we can utilize in our provisions of government, utilize ARPA funding to help with operational cost within the formulary amount that I shared earlier in coming up with that. What is that value of provisions of government? And so if we can reprogram within provisions of government, not exceeding the value that's allowable by ARPA, to help those that we do reprogram from in the general funds budget, we can do that. But it does not mean that we're using ARPA for pensions. And so that's where I shared with the Senate when they asked me, we can backfill and utilize ARPA provisions of government to help for those areas that we're going to pull money from, to identify these funds out of general fund to pay for the retirement bonuses. Now, keep in mind that the original intent of the joint resolution at the time, in order for us to pay the retirees, we can budget, we can reprogram within the 25% that the governor has, but according to the AG, we could not do it because there's no program, there's no retirement program account that we can reprogram money to take care of the $500 original bonus for the retirees. And so we needed a House joint resolution. I mean, we needed a joint resolution in order to create that account, and then for us to go within our 25% limitation the governor has today. But then the new version is giving him 100 for general funds.
Would it be your recommendation then that the House reject the Senate version that they recently approved? Because there is no funding source. And then they inserted language that forces the House to grant the governor 100% reprogramming. And you've already stated that the governor can do it within his 25% reprogramming authority authorized by the statute.
We can provide the bonuses if the original joint resolution was passed within the 25% that the governor has. The Senate version is giving him 100%, as well as increasing the amount from 500 to 1,000. And I'm being biased. I would say either one, if approved, will allow us to give the retirees. If you reject it, then we aren't able to help the retirees.
Well, there's only two choices at this point that the House has, because it originated in the House. We identified a funding source, sent it up to the Senate. They changed it and doubled it, and then it comes back. The only choices the House of Representative has at this point is to either reject it or accept it. And if we reject it, we go into conference committee. We ask them to go into conference committee, and then only then can we amend that resolution. So that's,
You mean,
my comment with respect
you
to
mean
that.
amend the law, right? Because it's a bill.
Yes, yes. The other thing is, I forgot, I lost my train. Oh, how much ARPA money was given to the Casino Commission, the Rhoda Casino Commission, and the Tinian Casino Commission? How
None,
much in ARPA funds?
no ARPA funds went to any of those commissions.
None. Okay. Okay, thank you. That was it. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Secretary Atalik. I have a, go ahead, recognize Representative Joel.
Thank you. I just want to do a follow. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to do a follow-up question on Rep. Balta, what she mentioned and what you mentioned earlier with regards to provision of government. So in the House version, the way we addressed the retirement bonus was we kind of went into specific business units. But in terms of the ARPA and the way it applies to provision of government, couldn't we just do like an across-the-board cut to every agency's operations for that matter, right? And just replenish it from in the back end through ARPA if we don't go over the cap as what you mentioned earlier to identify the other half.
That's another scenario. That's if the legislature passes, that's another way of reprogramming the current general funds budget. Is an across the board share to help the retirees. That's suitable.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rep. Joel. I do have a few clarifying and follow-up questions with regards to the premium pay. So I'd like to start off with the criteria for the $5,000. Is the $5,000 gross or net?
That is gross. It's subject to salary and wage taxes.
Got it. And were there any employees that received more than the $5,000?
Yes, in the first batch, there were some that received. We did two batches, one for 5,000 and the rest for 1,000. There are several that are in both lists, that happen to be on both lists, and so we're still working on that, identifying the total of that, and making a decision whether how we're going to retrieve back the extra 1,000 that's above our criteria.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And then for those active employees who met the eligibility period through 9/30/2021, if they, for whatever reason, left the government, were they also paid?
If they left prior to,
I mean, they were within that period, right? So they qualify, but for whatever reason, like
and they
let's
left
say
after
November,
that date,
yeah, like in November, they were no longer active employees. Did they receive the premium pay?
if they're not active, then I would assume that they didn't receive it because we're using payroll data and active employee payroll information. So there are several that you bring that up because there are actually a couple that came to my attention that they resigned or left after the cutoff, but they're no longer active today. And so, but they're within the guidance of this. So those are being worked on as a one-time pay, just like I mentioned to Rep. Probst that we are taking care and identifying those that were with us that are no longer with us, and how are we going to get them their premium pay that we have allocated for them. And with the system, because they're not in payroll, we'll need to do it almost like a vendor payment, or like, we're still working this out because I do this also with Rev and Tax. And if we can use somehow that system that we have their information, can we cut a check and pay them? But it is considered a, a, a salary. Premium pay is considered salary and not like a stimulus or a bonus.
Okay. And so in reading the criteria for the 5,000, number two, it says you would have to at least work 40 hours on COVID or directly to mitigate the spread within the period. And so I was just curious because you said CUC was one of those entities who requested for the funds. So how can you explain to us how they met the criteria?
Well, they didn't really fall within these criteria. We asked them to use our guidance. They, as a board, as an organization, and their board can um, uh, approve how they're going to give premium pay. And so, in the case of CUC, the executive director, with approval from the board, requested um, for an amount for premium pay. And I believe, as we all know or have heard, it's number of employees that they had times 5,000. So when we reviewed the requests, I reviewed it, our team, it's within our budget, and we got the governor's approval. Then we submitted that we remitted that requests to CUC. We did the same for CPA, and NMC is pending, but they submitted their requests. And then a lot of the independent boards that had staff asking.
And
Yes.
I'm just asking for the clarification because it appears to me as I read this that the premise of the premium pay was to follow the guidelines, right? And so I'm trying to connect how CUC falls within this premise.
In terms of CUC, just because I did have conversations with the executive director, he shared that during the whole pandemic, even during the shutdown, that they all worked, and so that's his explanation to saying that everyone worked more than 40 hours towards keeping water, power, and our sewer systems up to par. So, yeah, I mean, it could be a question that you can have directly with them in terms of how they determined. But the way we looked at it, Department of Finance and the governor's office, is the request came in. It's within our ARPA guidelines and ARPA rules, and we gave them our criteria, and then it's up to them how they give the money out.
I guess what I was trying to get to is the premise of this premium pay was to help pay employees who were at least 40 hours
Yes.
working on COVID or helping mitigate the situation, right? So if that was the premise for the premium pay,
Yeah.
I get it. Like I know that CUC was working during that time, but if the premise for the premium pay was to mitigate COVID, like how were they involved in that process? So I guess the question would be for the governor.
Okay.
Okay. Next, was there a budget for this premium pay or it's just?
Yes, there is. It's part of our spending plan.
Okay. How much was budgeted for this particular premium
Yeah.
pay?
I want to say 30 million at top of my head. We did budget, I believe it was 10 million for FY 2021, and there was also 5 million for private healthcare outside of the government. So I believe the number is a $30 million spending plan out of our ARPA.
Okay. And my last question is, I believe it was already asked about the private sector, but just so that we're on the record, the government has no plans to pay premium pay to the private sector.
That's incorrect. We are in the process of processing premium pay requests for healthcare, private healthcare companies in the private sector, as we had planned in our spending plan.
So just the
So-
private healthcare
Yeah,
and not any other
not
private
other,
sector.
right, that's correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Recognize Representative Tina Sabon.
Yeah, just to clarify the figures. So 30 million total was budgeted for premium pay, Mr. Secretary, and then, but the 10 million that you cited earlier that was allocated, that was just for the executive branch? Is that correct?
Fiscal.
No, it's not just for the executive branch. It's just that the executive branch was the first big batch that of premium pay that went out.
So what was the 10 million allocation that you mentioned earlier for premium pay? If
I believe I budgeted or had in the spending plan, and I apologize, I didn't have the ARPA spending plan in front of me, but I'm going to pull it up. But basically, the ARPA part for premium pay, we had an amount for FY 2021 and an amount for FY 2022. And so, ARPA plan, okay, here. And I'm speaking on the top of my head, and but I will have the exact numbers based on my spending plan. But for premium pay, we know that we allocated, I believe it was 10 million for FY 2021, which we've already submitted and given the CHCC because they were the first to request it and had their plan for their. Okay, here I got it. So premium pay is ARPA section 602B, which we allocated $30 million. And the way we broke down the $30 million was that $25.5 million was going to go to the public health and emergency and government cost. The other $4.5 million was allocated for, we made it for private healthcare companies responding to the COVID health emergency. And in FY 2021, I apologize, not 10 million. We budgeted 6 million in FY 2021, and in FY 2022 is 24 million. So a total of $30 million for premium pay.
okay, thank you for clarifying that. I yield.
Thank you, members. I
Privilege?
think, state your privilege.
I would like to clarify one more thing because I received
Please.
a notice.
Okay.
I just wanted to let you know that PSS did submit a letter requesting for premium pay, and if they could please review and see that they are also addressed, because they have been providing vaccination screening on site, even providing PPEs, nurses administrating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they are considered frontliners. And so we would like to ask that you please review that. Their letter was sent to the governor. Thank you.
Okay, that was good. Thank you.
But is that something that the administration can assist with in regards to PSS, despite them also getting their share of?
That's what I'll have to review, and I'll look at look to my ARPA team to review, because they are qualified for premium pay within their allocation that they receive. That's my assumption.
Yeah.
I will have to review, and yes, it is allowable to help them.
Thank you, members. We do have health and welfare in a couple of minutes, but I just want to close out. Let's have one other clarifying question. Now, CUC, I understand, but where does MVA fall into this? How do they qualify for the 5,000? They don't
They
directly-
also are a independent program that has a board, and they did also request for their employees. I'll have to look, but I don't recall actually transferring that yet to them. But they
Okay,
are.
so whatever they would have gotten, if not from you, then it's
They have to get it from them because they
from
handle their
what they
own
were
payroll.
allotted. Okay. So clarified. Secretary, I understand that you did try to get, or at least looking at the email you sent us, there were several pages that were left blank, like towards part 9 or something like that, or I may have to look again. yeah, reprogramming. Maybe we can get that from OMB, but um, we do have another meeting this afternoon, and there are several other things that we would like to ask. But at this time, maybe we'll circle back next week because we do want to call you in regards to one of the legislation that's in the committee, which is the MPLT request for the 15 million. And so after the members had get the time to review the documents you sent us, we'll come up with a shorter list and schedule a meeting for sometime next week whenever everyone will be available. And so with that, members, secretary, and to your team, thank you so much for coming in this afternoon, this morning, and answering a lot of our questions. This is certainly useful information that we can share with our constituents. And so, members, with that, we will adjourn and then schedule another meeting sometime next week after our session. Again, thank you, Secretary. And if there's anything you'd like to close with.
I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to share with you and answer your questions directly, because I understand in the past there's a lot of assumption and without getting direct answer. And then I also want to thank Vice Chair as well as Chairman for your patience with our schedule. I know you wanted to meet with me earlier. I was off island and so forth, but I appreciate working with me, and I am available to meet with this committee as much as you need me, and hopefully my schedule can permit. But I appreciate the opportunity to answer directly and not have things assumed and get blown out of proportion. But I appreciate it, and I want to thank you guys for your time as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again, Secretary Atalik, for making the time to come in and brief us with some updates and also answer a lot of our questions. And so we do look forward to meeting with you next week, hopefully, as we still have more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, Secretary, you are excused. Members, we will now rise back into our committee and adjourn. At this time, we now move on to item 5, miscellaneous. Any members? If none, can I get a motion to adjourn? Motion was made and seconded. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. Motion carries. This meeting is hereby adjourned at 12:39 p.m.